The kettle whistled gently, its steam curling toward the ceiling like it had somewhere to go. I turned off the stove, poured hot water over 2 chamomile tea bags, and placed the mugs on the small tray. My hands moved automatically, but my mind was far from the kitchen. As I walked back into the living room, I found Kyle exactly where I left him, sitting quietly, elbows on his knees, hands clasped together as if he were bracing for something. He looked up as I entered, and his expression softened. The moment our eyes met, still like honey in yours, I asked. He smiled faintly. Always. I handed him the mug, then sat beside him again. The heat of the tea warming my palms as much as the closeness between us warmed something deeper inside. We sipped in silence for a while. Outside, the rain had slowed, tapping lightly on the roof like a heartbeat. It felt like the house itself was holding its breath. Kyle finally broke the quiet. Do you ever wonder what life might have been like if things had gone differently? I looked over at him, how he shrugged. If Dad had lived longer, if Sarah and I had worked, if you and I talked like this more. I considered that. I used to wonder, but after a while I stopped. Life isn't just about what happens, it's about what we do with what's left. He took a slow sip of tea, then nodded, his gaze distant for a moment. I didn't think I ever knew how much I missed this, he said, being here with you, feeling like I could just be. I reached over and placed my hand on his forearm. It was a small touch, but it meant something. It reminded him and me that we weren't floating in separate worlds. You always had that, I said softly. Even when you forgot. He looked at me again, more intently now. And you had someone you could just be with? I mean, since Dad? The question felt like it came from nowhere and everywhere at once. I opened my mouth and paused. I've had moments, I admitted, people, but nothing that stayed, nothing that asked me how I was doing. At the end of the day, everyone always assumes mothers are just strong. We don't get the same softness in return. He was quiet for a moment, his brows drawn together in thought. You deserve that softness. You deserve more than just being the strong one all the time. I smiled, faintly touched in a way I hadn't expected. That means more than you know. Then, almost without thinking, he reached out and tucked a strand of my hair behind my ear, like I used to do for him when he was little. The gesture was tender, almost reverent. Our eyes locked, and the moment felt fuller somehow. I see you, he said, not just as my mom, as you. Something about the way he said it, slow, careful, made my breath catch. I didn't feel exposed, I felt understood, which in some ways is even more intimate. I placed my mug down on the side table and turned slightly to face him. That's a hard thing to explain, Kyle. How being seen like that really seen feels. He nodded. I think I'm only just starting to understand it. His voice had dropped again, that raw, almost vulnerable tone that made me want to wrap him in a blanket and hold him like he was still 5. But he wasn't 5. He was 38, a grown man carrying pieces of himself he hadn't shared with anyone in years. I could see in his posture, in his eyes, that he was still holding something. And what is it? I asked. He hesitated, then finally said, sometimes I feel like I don't know how to be close to anyone anymore, like I forgot. And that scares me. I reached out and gently rested my hand on his cheek. He didn't flinch or pull away, he just leaned into it, eyes fluttering closed for a moment. You didn't forget. I said, you just needed to remember what it feels like. And I'm here, you're not alone in this. His hand rose and cupped mine against his face, his thumb gently tracing the back of my hand. It was the kind of touch that was comforting, not urgent, intentional, human. The room felt suspended in that moment. We weren't mother and son, in the traditional sense, not. Then we were 2 people who had spent a lifetime putting others first, and were finally finding space to feel, to speak, to simply be. You always made me feel safe, he said, opening his eyes again. But tonight, I feel something more. I feel known. The weight of that struck deep. I leaned in, pressing my forehead gently to his again, just as he had earlier. We stayed like that, eyes closed, hands joined, breathing, feeling, and I realized something in that silence. There are moments that defy explanation, that aren't about labels or roles or what society expects. They're about connection, truth, the way two souls recognize each other beyond time and structure. When we finally leaned back, the clock on the wall ticked softly, reminding us that time was still moving even if we'd stepped outside of it for a while. He smiled again, tired, but genuine. I should probably get going, he said, or I offered gently. You could stay the night, guest room's ready. He looked at me surprised, then nodded slowly. Yeah, I'd like that. As I gathered the empty mugs and he rose to his feet, I felt something warm settle into my chest. Not just comfort, not just relief, hope, because sometimes even the smallest shift, a conversation, a look, a shared moment can begin to change everything. The house was still, not the kind of stillness that feels lonely, but the kind that cradles you, that hush after a long conversation. When your heart has been cracked open and somehow it doesn't hurt. Not anymore. I turned down the hallway. Kyle walking just behind me, his socks making a soft shuffling sound on the floorboards. It reminded me of when he was younger, when he'd pad after me late at night after a bad dream, trying not to let me hear him, but I always did. The guest room hadn't been used much, just once in a while when my sister visited or an old friend stayed over. I opened the door and switched on the lamp. The soft amber light filled the small room, and for a moment I hesitated in the doorway. You can use the blanket in the closet if it gets cold, I said, stepping aside to let him in. Kyle nodded, his eyes moving slowly around the space like he was seeing it for the first time. Thanks, me. He looked tired, not just physically but in the way a man looks when he's carried too much for too long, and finally put it down. I stood there a little longer, uncertain, wanting to leave but also not quite ready to. Do you? He started, then stopped. He scratched the back of his neck, like he used to do when he was nervous. Do you maybe want to sit with me for a little while? Just until I fall asleep? The question landed soft, but heavy. I nodded once. Yeah, I can do that. He sat on the bed, leaning back against the pillows, and I pulled the old armchair from the corner to sit beside him. I watched him settle in his chest, rising and falling more evenly. Now his shoulders finally unburdened. For a while we didn't speak. I just sat there watching him in the dim glow of the lamp. The years seemed to fall away, not in a way that erased the past, but in a way that connected us to it. As if the versions of ourselves we used to be were all present in the room with us now. I used to be afraid you'd get tired of me, he said. Suddenly I turned to him. What he looked at? The ceiling, his voice barely above a whisper. When I was a teenager, I was angry all the time, lashing out, slamming doors. I remember once you just stood in the hallway after I yelled at you and you didn't say a word, just stood there. I remember, I said softly, I thought I'd pushed you too far, that one day you'd give up on me. I reached over then, placing my hand on the blanket near his arm. Never. His eyes shifted to mine, tired, open, vulnerable. I know that now, but I didn't then, and it stayed with me, even with Sarah, with everyone. I kept waiting for people to leave. I leaned in slightly, and now he smiled faintly. Now I'm starting to believe some people don't. The silence that followed felt sacred, not empty, just honest. He reached out and covered my hand with his. I don't know what tonight was, he said, but it mattered more than I can explain. I nodded, holding his gaze. It mattered to me too, and it did, not because it changed what we were, mother and son, but because it deepened it. It reminded me that connection doesn't always follow rules or titles. Sometimes it just is. I feel safe with you, he said quietly, like I can breathe again. You can. I whispered. The lamp's light cast a golden ring around us, and I could hear the soft rustle of the trees outside. I thought of all the nights I'd sat alone wishing for something I couldn't name. This moment might have been it all along. Not romance, not adventure, just closeness, recognition, a shared breath. Eventually, I stood his hand, lingered on mine a moment longer before letting go. I'll let you sleep, I said as I reached the doorway. He spoke again. Mom. I turned. Thank you for everything and for tonight. I smiled. Good night, Kyle. Back in my own room, I lay on my side, staring out the window at the soft night sky. My heart was full, but not overwhelmed. There was no confusion, no discomfort, just peace. Some moments don't need to be defined. Some bonds don't need to be boxed, and sometimes being truly seen by someone being held emotionally wholly without expectation is the most powerful experience of all that night. I didn't feel alone, and I knew he didn't either. And that more than anything was. You won't believe how a simple hug in the living room turned into a moment that changed how I saw everything. It wasn't anything wild, but it was something special, something real and very human. If you've ever had someone look at you not just with their eyes but with their whole heart, then you'll get it. Before we jump in, let me ask, from which cities are you watching us tonight? Drop it in the comments. We love hearing where our community is tuning in from now. Let me tell you what happened. That day, it was one of those Sundays where the world seemed quieter than usual. The rain had softened into a mist outside, and the air inside our home held that cozy stillness, like the house itself had decided to rest. I had just finished washing the last of the dishes from our late brunch, and Carl, my son, was sitting on the couch flipping through the channels like he always did when he didn't want to talk, but didn't want to be alone. Either he had come by to check on me, something he'd been doing more often lately. I told him he didn't need to that. I was perfectly fine living here by myself now that the house had grown so quiet, but I think he needed these visits more than he let on. I dried my hands on the dish towel and walked into the living room. The dim lighting from the corner lamp cast a soft amber glow, making everything feel like a memory before it even passed you hungry again. I asked, resting my hand on the back of the armchair. Kyle turned to look at me and smiled. That small crooked smile he got from his father. No, Ma, I'm good, just wanted to sit a while longer, of course. I sat on the edge of the couch beside him, smoothing my skirt under my legs. We didn't speak for a few moments. The kind of silence that wasn't awkward, just full. I don't know why I did it. Maybe it was instinct or habit, but I leaned in and wrapped my arms around him. Just a hug, nothing more. He didn't move at first, then slowly his arms came around my back tighter than usual. That's when I felt it. His breathing changed, shallow, hesitant, like something was being held back. I pulled back a little and looked up at him, expecting a joke, or maybe a comment about how I always smelled like lavender and lemon from the kitchen soaps, but instead he just stared at me, really stared. There was something behind his eyes I hadn't seen in a long time, not since he was a boy, and used to crawl into my bed after a nightmare. It wasn't fear, though it was longing, deep, aching and quiet. You okay? I asked, searching his face. He didn't answer right away. His jaw tensed slightly, like he was biting back words. Then he nodded once, but he didn't look away. Something shifted between us, not in a bad way, just real. There was no pretending in that moment, no mother trying to fix things, no son trying to be strong, just two people, one heart quietly asking to be seen, and another silently responding. I didn't pull away. I didn't speak. I let the quiet between us thicken like warm syrup. I miss feeling close to someone, he said finally, voice barely above a whisper. My chest tightened, not from pain, but recognition, that ache. I knew it well. I'd felt it for years now, since his father passed, since my own skin began to feel unfamiliar in the mirror, since laughter in this house became less frequent. I reached up and brushed a bit of his hair back from his forehead, something I hadn't done in ages. You're not alone, Kyle. He swallowed hard and nodded, but his eyes were still on mine, and they didn't flicker away like they usually did. That was the moment, not the hug, not the words, but that look, that deep searching gaze, like he was asking me, do you see me not just as your son, but as a man, as someone trying to be whole again? And I did see him. The couch creaked slightly under us as we sat closer than usual, still quiet, still tangled in a moment neither of us knew how to name. There was no urgency, no fear, just presence. He rested his head gently on my shoulder, and I held him just like I had when he was little, but now we were equals in our need, equals in our silence. Outside, the mist had turned to rain again, steady and soft. And in that small living room, with the scent of coffee still lingering, and the faint sound of an old movie playing in the background, I felt something loosen in my chest. a knot that had been tied there for years. This wasn't just about motherhood, or aging or loneliness. It was about seeing and being seen, and for the first time in a long, long while, we both felt understood. The rain had deepened into a steady rhythm, tapping gently against the windows, like a forgotten lullaby. The soft flicker from the television cast moving shadows across the living room walls, but neither of us was watching anymore. Kyle's head was still resting on my shoulder. His body relaxed now, but his fingers lightly fidgeted with the hem of his sleeve, a quiet signal he was still thinking. I stayed still, not wanting to interrupt whatever was flowing beneath the surface. For him, being a mother teaches you when not to speak sometimes. Presence is more powerful than words after a long pause. He finally shifted slightly, sitting up but not pulling away completely. His hand rested close to mine on the couch cushion, not touching but close enough to feel warmth. "I didn't mean to make that weird," he said, his voice quiet, almost embarrassed. "It wasn't weird," I replied, gently glancing at him. "It was real." He looked at me, then grateful, but also unsure, as if he was testing the waters of what was safe to share. He'd always been that way, thoughtful, cautious, never wanting to burden others with what he carried inside. "I don't talk to anyone like this, May, not even Sarah." He hesitated before adding, "Not even when we were married." There, it was a truth tucked between unspoken memories. I reached out and placed my hand over his. The gesture was simple, but it felt like more a bridge built from trust, not obligation. "You don't have to explain," I said. But he shook his head. "No, I want to. I need to." His voice cracked a little, and I could see the redness in his eyes. He blinked quickly and looked down at our hands after the divorce. I thought I'd feel relieved, like I had space to breathe again, that all I felt was hollow. I'd come home from work and sit in the car for half an hour, just staring at the driveway, not wanting to walk into an empty house. The silence. "It's different when you're not choosing it," I nodded, squeezing his hand. I know he glanced at me, studying my face like he was seeing it in a new light. "You do, don't you?" "I'd lived in silence too, Kyle, after your father passed." I pretended it was peace, but it wasn't. It was just absence, a quiet filled the space between us again, but this time it was heavier. Like everything we both kept buried for years had finally surfaced and was floating there, waiting to be acknowledged. "I remember Dad used to hold you when he thought I wasn't looking," Kyle said suddenly. "Just little moments in the kitchen, on the porch. You looked so safe in his arms. I used to think I want that one day, someone who makes me feel like home." I looked at him and felt a knot in my throat, not from sadness, but from the deep, aching beauty of his honesty. "You will," I whispered, "but until then you still have arms that know how to hold and be held. You still have people who care." He turned fully toward me. Now his body slightly angled, his gaze tender. "Do you?" he asked. "Do you feel that, like, you have someone who sees you anymore?" His question caught me off guard, not because it was bold, but because it was rare in all my years of being a mother, a widow, a woman. I don't know if anyone had asked me that so directly. I took a breath, studying myself. Sometimes I answered truthfully, but most days I feel invisible, like the world kept moving, and I became a backdrop to it. People don't really look at women my age anymore. They don't ask us how we feel, they just assume we're fine, because we're still standing. Kyle looked at me with something I hadn't seen in a long time. A soft reverence, like he was realizing something for the first time. "You're not invisible to me," he said. My breath caught for just a moment, not because I needed validation, but because being seen, really seen by someone you love, is its own kind of grace. I smiled and brushed his cheek with the back of my fingers. "And you're not alone." We sat there in the dim glow of the living room, our hands still joined, our hearts no longer armored. He leaned in, then slow, unsure, but with purpose, not for a kiss, not for anything inappropriate, just to rest his forehead gently against mine. It was a gesture that carried years of unspoken emotion, respect, gratitude, longing for connection in a world that rarely slows down long enough for it. I closed my eyes and let the closeness wrap around me like a warm shawl. My son, my boy, but also a man who had weathered pain, and still dared to be. Vulnerable, we stayed like that for a while, breathing in sync. Letting the past settle and the present expand eventually, I pulled back slightly and looked at him again. You want some tea? He smiled, the first genuine smile of the night, and nodded. Yeah, that sounds perfect, as I stood and walked toward the kitchen. I didn't feel old or lonely. I felt alive, seen, needed, and I knew something had shifted between us, not a boundary crossed, but a wall lowered.